The Tudors Dynasty Podcast.
Hello and welcome back to the show. I'm your host, Rebecca Larson, and today I am so pleased to welcome to the show Professor Tracy Adams. Tracy, welcome.
Thank you. Really happy to be here.
I feel like you came so highly recommended to have on the show, and mostly because of this new article that you just had come out, and that is going to be what we're talking about today. I've recently said on the show that Anne Boleyn is the gateway queen for many Tudor enthusiasts, and she is also the person sometimes that people love to hate.
Yeah.
And I love that in this article, we kind of get to see both sides of that in Anne's story. You know, we see Henry's side and we see, let's say, the ambassador's side of the story as well. So before we go into all of that, Tracy, why don't you let everybody know what the topic of this peer-reviewed article is all about?
Okay, you've already said so many things that I wanted to jump in and say something about, but so now I'm going to restrain myself and just say the basic idea behind the article is just that the narrative that Henry VIII asked Anne to become his mistress and that she coyly refused him, hoping to become queen, is something that just can't be supported with the evidence that is typically used to support it, for the simple reason that the word mistress doesn't mean mistress in our sense in the 16th century. So it's a word that's used in French to refer to the person that you're going to marry typically. And just one of the many examples here is Henry IV of France refers to his wife-to-be, Marie de Médicis, as ma maîtresse, telling her over and over again that when we marry, then you will take on another name. You'll become ma femme. You will no longer be ma maîtresse. So mistress in that sense just means the person that you're going to marry. It's a person that you're in love with. And the same thing is true in Tudor England. So you read the Paston letters, for example, and they refer to the woman they're going to marry as my mistress. So when Henry VIII asks Anne to become his seule maîtresse, his only mistress, what he's saying is that I want you to marry me. Quit being afraid, quit hesitating here to marry me, because Anne is, for very obvious reasons, afraid to marry Henry VIII. I mean, she's nervous about usurping the queen. I mean, she can imagine the kind of uproar that's going to cause. So she hesitates. And so in this famous letter that has been interpreted as an invitation for Anne to become Henry's mistress, what he's really doing is saying, don't be afraid to marry me. When I marry you, I will not have other women. You will be ma seule maîtresse. So become my wife. That's really what he's saying. And that's the idea of the article. So it's sort of, it's a challenge to the narrative of Anne as a sort of coy, flirtatious woman who's trying to finagle a marriage proposal.
Right. And in the end, Henry lied, didn't he?
Oh, of course he lied. Maybe he probably wasn't lying when he said it. He probably meant it. One thing that you read there's a beautiful little section in Alexander Ailes' letter to Queen Elizabeth. I mean, so long after Anne was dead, but he explains that all of Henry VIII's courtiers told him that Henry VIII fell madly in love every time he fell in love, which was quite often. And so when he fell in love, he was all in, and then he kind of quickly fell out of love. Nice guy.
Yeah, right. Exactly. He loved the feeling of being in love, is what it sounds like.
Yeah, and he had that feeling about all of his wives, except for Anne of Cleves, but he was madly in love with Catherine of Aragon. And something that I always thought was interesting is that when he's describing his love for Catherine to Catherine's father, Ferdinand, he uses exactly the same word that he uses to refer to his love for Anne in that letter that we've just been talking about. He says that I have a singular, he says it in Latin, but it's the same thing. I have a singular love for your daughter, and if I could do it again, I would marry her, no other woman. So he says the same thing about Catherine of Aragon that he later says about Anne Boleyn, and then he's in love with all of his other wives except Anne of Cleves. So yeah, what can you say? So I don't think he's particularly in love with Anne Boleyn. Just at the time, he happens to be in love with her.
Yeah. Let's talk about what led you to this article and the research that you did that allowed you to come up with this alternative history.
Yeah. I just love talking about this stuff. I think it's so fascinating. When you come to the Tudor stuff as a non-Tudor person, which is what I did. So my area has always been late medieval France. Um, I started reading about Anne Boleyn. Actually, I should say that like everyone does, I read about Anne Boleyn when I was a kid. I mean, I was fascinated with her, as are all people from deepest, darkest Minnesota. We sit in the libraries as 12-year-olds and read like The Concubine and that kind of those wonderful historical romances. So, I mean, I was aware of her, but I came to her through studying the court of Claude of France. So I was sort of backwards in my approach. But the thing that always struck me was that we have this impression of her as a sort of feisty brunette bombshell. And I wondered where that came from. And it also struck me that we describe her in these terms that are very sort of Orientalist. I mean, as this sort of dark, exotic woman. And that way of thinking about people really wasn't available until the 19th century, when you start to get the idea of the trope of the femme fatale. And so the words that we use to describe her today come straight out of the 19th century. And so I was looking at that and then realized that the five physical descriptions of Anne Boleyn from her own lifetime, which are meant as objective statements. I mean, meant to convey to somebody what she really looked like, as opposed to insult her. I mean, there are all kinds of insulting descriptions of her too, like the goggle-eyed whore, those famous little ditties. But the five descriptions of her come from ambassadors' letters, which kind of vanished after her death. I mean, it's not as they are gone, but they just aren't read. And then they come back in the mid-19th century when J.S. Brewer starts to edit the state papers. And so suddenly they're available again, these descriptions of Anne Boleyn. And there's just one in particular that has become the basis for the idea of Anne as this sort of feisty, exotic, dark-haired, bombshell, I guess, this person who's so sexually alluring. And it's the opinion of a Venetian ambassador. So Venice hates England at this point. So the Venetian ambassador, 1532 in Calais, looks at her and says that she's not the most beautiful woman in the world. I mean, you know this description, right? She's got dark, beautiful eyes. And the only thing that she actually has is the great appetite of the king. So it's this one description by a hostile observer that has formed the basis of our whole idea of Anne Boleyn today. That comes back into circulation with Brewer's editions of the state papers, and then it's read through the lens of the femme fatale trope, and then we end up with the Anne Boleyn that we know today. But if you go back before the 20th century, she's nothing like that. I mean, the descriptions from her own lifetime would not lead you at all to this exotic woman with whom Henry VIII was so passionately in love. So there, I'll stop there and hear what you want to, if you want to respond to that.
Yeah, I think I want to transition from this, which is only a slight transition, to the love letters, because this is something that you really focus on in the article as well, and how these letters, we may look at them a little differently now that we have this better definition of the word, maybe.
Yeah, the love letters are really important because they tell us something about the relationship between the two of them, obviously, but I think that we've also misunderstood the dates associated with the relationship. So that same letter, the Son Maîtresse letter, which is like a really important one. If you're looking at the Vatican Library's collection, if you go online and read the letters, they're digitized. That's the fourth letter. So no one really knows the arrangement of the letters, and historians don't agree on what order they were written in. But there has been a kind of consensus based on that letter, which says, I've been in love with you now for about a year. Historians had dated that letter to about 1527 and concluded that they were in love in 1526. And so I have I think that date is wrong. I think that this letter wasn't written, as the others were not written, until about 1528. I think that the occasion for it was probably the sweating sickness when she was sort of sent down to Heber to get out of danger. And so that would have given an occasion for Henry VIII to write to her. I mean, I don't see any reason for thinking that they knew each other. I mean, they were aware of each other. He was aware of her, obviously, before she even came back to England from France, because of Thomas Boleyn, because her father was one of his most important diplomats, so and a close friend too. So Henry VIII knew about her, and she comes back to England in 1522, depending on what you believe her birth date was, at the age of 14 or 21. I think 14, actually, 14 or 15. So she comes back to the English court, and Henry VIII he has to know about her, but he has no interest in her. I mean, in fact, he's having an affair with her sister probably at the same time. So something that's always here, I really will get back to the letters, but something that's always kind of baffled me is that we are asked to believe that at some point in 1526, he takes another look at this woman who has been known to him for 4 years and suddenly decides that he's madly in love with her and can't live without her, which is, maybe I'm being a little too anachronistic here, but lust doesn't typically work like that. Maybe love, you get to know someone over a long period of time, but you don't just take another look at someone and then suddenly fall passionately in lust with them. So I always thought that it must really be a little bit different from that. And my idea is that since no ambassador mentions a mysterious lady love, or certainly not Anne Boleyn, as attached to the king until May of 1527, it seems to me really implausible that those eagle-eyed ambassadors had not gotten wind of a new affair earlier. They say nothing about her until May 1527, and that is at a dance being held for the French embassy. An embassy from France has come over. They're holding a big festival, dancing and so on. And then at that point, Henry and Anne are observed dancing together. That's the first time they're ever mentioned together. And I think they were probably having a conversation that night. And suddenly he realized that Anne Boleyn is very favorable to a personal relationship with God. And so he goes, oh, this person understands how it is that suddenly I have scruples from reading the Leviticus prohibition and don't want to be married to Catherine anymore because I need a son. You know, God has spoken to me, told me I need a new wife. And this woman is probably the one. And so I think that it happened very quickly, 1527, and he's going to marry her already in August of 1527. And we know that because he's asked for the dispensation, which dispenses him to marry someone with whom he has, is it a first degree of affinity and a second degree of consanguinity or something like that. I've forgotten what that is exactly. But anyways, it's clearly Anne he's talking about. And there are also rumors by that point. So ambassadors are writing that Henry VIII is rumored to be wanting to marry Anne Boleyn. So those are our dates, I think. So they fall in love May 1527, and then the letters are referring back to that date. I fell in love with you about a year ago. He's writing them in July of 1528, and then after that, so they continue on for a while. So I think that the letters give us a clue about the type of relationship he wants, which is always marriage, because he needs a new wife. He needs somebody who's going to give him the son. And I think that God spoke to him, in air quotes, spoke to him and told him it's Anne Boleyn who's going to give you this wife. And he convinces Anne. She's reluctant, but she eventually decides that she'll marry him. And then he has to keep talking her into it. I mean, in several of the letters, he says, don't quit being afraid. It's all going to come out okay. And she doesn't quite believe him, but eventually she does. And then she's all in. And the letters kind of give us that, the trajectory of that relationship.
I think we all want to put ourselves in the mind of Anne Boleyn. What was she thinking during this time? And what was the clincher in the letters from him that made her decide?
What was the clincher? I mean, I don't know what he said to her. I mean, I'm not sure what someone said to her that convinced her that this annulment was really going to happen, annulment or divorce, that something convinced her that that really was going to happen and that she really was the one ordained by God, once again, in air quotes, to bear the Tudor heir. I don't know what he would have said to her to make her believe that, but somehow he kind of overcame her anxiety.
Mhm.
Um, we're all reading the same evidence, right? I mean, everyone who writes about Anne Boleyn is looking at the few, I mean, relatively speaking, few letters, few descriptions of her, and so on. And it's just really a question of what you emphasize, because I mean, you know the sort of traditional narrative, and you see the evidence of that, and you can read it in that way. But the way I read it, I emphasize her anxiety, and that certainly comes out in the letters because Henry is trying to convince her that she shouldn't be afraid. He also tells her in one very short letter, he says it's not really appropriate that I, the man, speak to you, my lady, my exalted lady, in as a master, but you have asked this of me, and so if you're more comfortable with this, I will speak to you like that. And so there, I can completely see her. She says at several points to different ambassadors that the king, the king didn't need to marry someone as wretched as me. You know, I'm so much lower than he is. So she's very much aware of that differential, which was the reason that she was understood as so inappropriate as a wife for him. So like throughout Europe, ambassadors and kings were saying, okay, you can have a divorce. There's no problem with getting a divorce, but not to marry this person. I mean, this person is not of the rank. I mean, she's not the right caste. You need to marry. Charles V says this. I always thought this was interesting. So Charles V, the nephew of Catherine of Aragon, who is opposing the marriage as vigorously as possible, says, well, if he wants to marry my sister, okay, and he wants her to he wants Henry VIII to marry Mary of Hungary. That's okay. Let him marry her, but just not Anne Boleyn. So Anne Boleyn is very much aware of this perception of her as not worthy of being the Queen of England, and so she's just anxious about the whole business. And I think it's only her religious devotion that pushes her eventually to agree to marry Henry VIII. And there's just one other thing I would like to say about that. Her finally sort of deciding that I will marry him. She didn't have to do that. Had she not wanted to marry him, all she would have had to do is say that, because there's no possibility that the Pope would have gone, oh yeah, Henry, we're going to give you an annulment to marry someone who doesn't want to marry you. I mean, that was just like inconceivable. So she had to agree, and that's why Henry VIII writes her these very flowery love letters in the idiom of love at that point.
Yeah. Those love letters. Don't we all wish we could see Anne's response to them?
Yeah, yeah. Or see Henry writing them. I know. Yeah,
Yes. Yeah, because
yeah.
we all
Or
know.
see the letters. Yeah, see the letters that she wrote back.
Right, exactly. Okay, so there was one thing that I noticed when I was reading your article that popped into my head. Do you believe that the idea of her being considered mistress, as we see it modern day, has something to do with, let's say, Chapuis calling her a concubine?
Yeah.
That misunderstanding between the two titles, so to speak, because we have an ambassador saying it, but we also have the king
Yeah.
saying it.
Yeah. Well, there's a long tradition, I mean, dating from her own lifetime, of people just assuming that she was his mistress in our understanding of the word. So I think that you find that all the way through. I don't know for sure. I mean, he calls her the concubine after they're already married. So his point is just to deny the validity of the marriage at all. But even before that, so Chapuis doesn't show up until 1529, when they are like the marriage is in the works. They're just kind of waiting. Well, it takes a while, but just kind of waiting for that all to happen. And he continues to call her the concubine after they're married in their own eyes. But even before that, people just assumed, they just took for granted that she was his mistress. So I think that that has always been out there as an idea, although not everybody thought that she was. So I think that we probably get it from that. And it's only fairly recently that that idea has been pretty much completely disavowed. I don't think that there are many historians today, like literally working right now, who think that she was his mistress before 1532. Or whatever the date of their clandestine marriage was. I think that pretty much everyone thinks that that they didn't actually have sexual relations because Elizabeth comes along as soon as they start, right? So that would have been like late 1532, and also because it's pretty clear that Henry VIII was very much interested in his reputation and did not want people to think that she was his mistress. So he denies that he's driven by lust. So yeah, so I think that idea has always been there.
Yeah. And you also talk about Nicholas Sanders or Saunders in this piece. You know, most people probably, if they're new to the Tudors, they have no idea why that name is so well known. Can you explain to people who he was and why we probably know him so well?
Yeah, he's a Catholic polemicist who, along with other Catholic polemicists, writing in the later 16th century. So I think that his book about the schism comes out in 15 around 1580, so 1576, 1580, something like that. And so what he's writing is is a history of the schism from the perspective of a person who despises the schism. And so in his story, Anne Boleyn is the villain. And I guess the reason he's so important is because he's responsible for some of the myths about her. Most important is the myth of her sixth finger. So he gives her, I've forgotten which hand it is now. He gives her a sixth finger on either the right hand, and then George Wyatt gives her a bit of a fingernail, an extra fingernail on one of her fingers on the other hand. But anyway, the idea of a sixth finger, which is actually a sign of witchcraft. So witches were apparently often described as having an extra digit or two. And so he may be drawing on that tradition, although he doesn't actually call her a witch, but that might be a sort of reference. So we get the sixth finger from Nicholas Sanders, and the sallow skin, the black hair. Nobody else, no one else describes the color of her hair, although the portraits show it as quite dark. But he says she's got black hair, skin that looks as if it's jaundiced, and the sixth finger. She also has a pretty mouth. She's nice to look at. So a sort of weird bag of sort of incongruous descriptions.
Yeah, I love that. She has a pretty mouth.
Yeah, whatever. After he's just said that she's got like a gaggle tooth, I think he calls it.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. So you also mention, let's see. So you talk about Chapuis. You talk about the French ambassadors too, don't you?
In that article, I can't even remember who all I talk about. Because I'm writing this book too at the same time and giving various essays, and I've got a couple other essays coming out on her. And so I'm sorry, I can't remember which things I put into which articles.
That's okay. I was just like skimming through it as we were talking here to see if I could find it. But why don't we transition to the more modern day takes on Anne Boleyn and how the standard narrative has continued for so long, and why you think that is.
Yeah, why is that? I think that the most recent stuff is pretty much because of Eric Ives' magnificent biography of Anne Boleyn, which it's a fabulous biography. It's got like every possible bit of information gathered into one large and beautifully organized volume. But he is writing from a particular perspective. He's describing her, first of all, I think, and you see this so often in historians, male historians, I think he's in love with the person he's writing about. So I would say Eric Ives himself, God forgive me for saying this, he's no longer with us, so he can't can just defend himself. I'll say this anyway, but I think that the woman that he describes is probably a woman who would have been very much to his liking. So he is the person who's responsible for the memorable expression that she radiated sex, which gets cited everywhere. So what was it if she wasn't that? She's got a fine head of hair, which is, of course, nowhere attested. I mean, no one knows anything about her hair. I mean, no one says anything about her hair, except that she wore it down in a couple of different, for her coronation. We're told that she is sitting in her litter in her hair, and the description in her hair just means with nothing on your head. It means that your hair is loose. So we're told, and then when she becomes the Marchioness of Pembroke, she's also described as having her hair down and jewels are woven through it. Nicholas Sanders tells us that her hair is black. That's all we know about her hair. There's no justification for his expression that she had a fine head of hair. And maybe she did, but we don't know. So he describes a woman, I think, that with a very particular type of beauty, a sort of non-beauty. So she's not really beautiful, but that means she's got to be really sexy for Henry to have been so madly in love with her. And so we get then the whole exotic sort of trope, the orientalizing discourse, which I want to stress, the orientalizing discourse is modern. I mean, that idea is not available to people at Henry VIII and Henry VIII's time. A person who has dark hair is quite simply less beautiful than a person who has blonde hair. So we just don't have that trope. That's something very modern. And Eric Ives doesn't invent it, but I think he sort of raises it, the description to an art. I mean, so everyone is now aware of Anne Boleyn as this particular type of non-beautiful beauty. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I wonder, do you think it's because his book on Anne Boleyn is seen as the Bible of Anne Boleyn that people are so nervous to buck against what he said?
Are they nervous? I don't know that people are nervous, because people will pretty much, I mean, you give all due respect and then you move on, because that's how scholarship works. So I think it's more that it's such an attractive story. And so one thing I'm doing in the book is thinking in terms of the beautiful dead girl celebrity narrative. And she fits so beautifully into this really potent narrative. That it's an attractive narrative. And to imagine Anne Boleyn then as just an anxious woman who is sort of convinced against her will to become the Queen of England, thinking of her in those terms feels like a loss, because the story that we know, this passionate love story, is so attractive, and it fits so well into a particular story that we hear so often today, which is a violent relationship. So you're madly in love, you can't live with him, you can't live without him, you fight, but then you make up. And you can get that narrative by reading Chapuis. I think that it's not the correct reading, but you can see how we're all reading the same stories. You can see how people would interpret what Chapuis says in those terms. And then the relationship turns violent. He has her beheaded, but that still fits into our sort of basic narrative. You know, he kills her in the end. It's a story that we know. It's familiar, and in a sort of titillating way, it's very exciting. We're used to seeing this narrative in film, you know, in novels. And so I think that's the reason that it remains so popular. It's just an exciting narrative, and the alternative is not nearly as exciting.
No, it's not. And really, the story of Anne Boleyn is what brings so many people into the Tudor era to study, which
absolutely.
I love it. So I am curious, Tracy, why do you believe that Henry VIII thought he had to have Anne Boleyn executed?
Had to have her executed. I think he decided when he got the final sign from God, which was the miscarriage in 1536, that he'd been duped, that she had duped him into believing that she was the one, which it's delusional, of course, but I think that that's what he actually believed. And he's not a person who acts rashly, even though he's a sort of big, exuberant, even though those words actually sound positive, and I really, since we're talking in this informal way, I would just say, I mean, he's not an attractive personality at all. He's murderous, thuggish person. And since World War II, we've known it's perfectly possible to be highly educated and a thug, a murderous thug. So I mean, I think Henry VIII is someone that I wouldn't want to say anything positive about. So what do we want to call him? I mean, but he's just got this big personality, and he's very charming. I mean, psychopaths are very charming. So he waits. I mean, he's capable of waiting for exactly the right opportunity. And he's just so hypersensitive about his own image. He knows he needs another wife, and he's got one in mind already by February or March of 1536. And he moves her into the palace. And you know who I'm talking about, of course. So she's living right there in the same space as poor Anne Boleyn. And he just has to figure out how he's going to get rid of her. From France, so Stephen Gardner is at the French court in March of 1536 during these months. And I think he turns up evidence in air quotes. I'm not sure what it would have been because we don't have any of the letters that he allegedly discovered, which indicate that Anne had committed adultery. We don't know when the adultery was supposed to have been committed, but this story comes from France that he has turned up evidence. And then we have this other sort of bizarre, this bizarre report from supposedly from Francis I, who said, yeah, I knew her when she was here. He's talking about Mary, her sister. He says Mary, and she was this great this great whore, prostitute, whatever. I think that if you look at the relative pronouns, he's actually talking about Anne, not about Mary. And so we've got these rumors from France that Anne had misbehaved, and that gives Henry sort of more fuel for his fire, and he's just waiting then for something to clinch the deal. And Cromwell is in on it then too. I mean, sort of directed by Henry to discover something. And then I think that what happens is it probably is, I mean, it's not me who's come up with this. I mean, everybody kind of knows this. I think it really is the story that she tells Kingston when she's being held in the Tower about Henry Norris. I think that's really what it is. She says that she describes in a really garbled way. I mean, the story doesn't make any sense the way Kingston tells it, but it's kind of along these lines, that Henry Norris was sort of sniffing around in her chambers. He's supposed to be marrying her cousin. And so Anne says, why are you not getting this show on the road? And then something happens. There's some kind of an exchange. And she says, oh my God, you want me, right? And then he goes, oh, no, absolutely not. And then she makes him go swear that she's a good woman. And so I think what happens is that suddenly she realizes how vulnerable she is, because it looks as if he's interested in her. And so she wants, because she sees what's going on, she feels very vulnerable. And so she wants to make sure that nobody believes that she has actually had any kind of relationship with her. But that only makes things worse. I mean, because saying it at all is what makes it known then to Cromwell, because Cromwell says, or Chapuis says that Cromwell told him that there was this relationship between Norris and the Queen. That's the first thing that comes out. I mean, Smeaton too, but there's supposed to be a relationship between Norris and the Queen. So I think that I've just told you in a very garbled way, something that was already garbled, but I think that that's what happens. So Henry is just waiting and accumulating evidence so that when we finally get the most important bit, that he can sort of pounce, and that's what happens. So I think she is already she's bound to be condemned already when the miscarriage happens. And people reading the same evidence have different ideas about what happened, but I think that's what happened.
Or blame Jane Seymour for coming into the picture.
I mean, if it hadn't been her, it would have been somebody else. But she's a person that she's easy to blame, isn't she? I mean, she's a person that is sort of easy to dislike because she's being coached to pretend that she's very, very, very prim and proper. And of course, she's not going to take the money from Henry VIII. She's going to give that back. And, that whole story it's one it's very easy to despise, but.
Yeah. Well,
but everyone is kind of working under the same patriarchal system.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I do feel I've been researching the Seymour the Seymour
Oh,
family
okay.
for
Okay.
oh gosh, 8 years now, and I
Yeah,
feel
yeah.
like the Seymours in general are just vilified. Like you mentioned Seymour, and people immediately think, "Oh, Jane Seymour," right?
Yeah, yeah.
Or they think Thomas and Edward Seymour for all the terrible things that they
Yeah,
did,
yeah, 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 yeah.
and yep, that's right. Just blame the Seymours.
So yeah, yeah. It's the Seymour's fault. So are you do you feel like they've all been vilified, or are you thinking mostly about Jane, or do you think Thomas also is
Oh, Thomas for sure. He's my focus. So
okay,
he's the
well,
one I've been focusing on, and I'm actually working on a book for him,
yeah.
where I look at all the primary sources
Mhm.
and pull it all together and provide a different narrative that people haven't seen. Like
Oh,
we've
I can't wait to hear. Oh, so he's not the what the sort of womanizer that the okay, I won't
yeah.
ask you now.
Yeah.
I know you, but I'm dying to
I
know.
just I like to compare him to Anne Boleyn in the respect that
hmm
they were both unjustly executed. That if you
hmm
go back and you look, there was really no charge. They did not commit treason.
Yeah.
And that the narrative that has been told about them hasn't changed very much over the centuries.
Mhm.
And like this article that you put out changes that narrative a little bit. And I think it's so important for people to look at all the evidence if you can. And I know
Yeah,
it's impossible to be able to study every single figure in history. But
yeah,
if there's one in particular that is being condemned, look at all the evidence.
yeah, yeah. I totally agree with you. And see if the narrative isn't one that's very familiar to us, so very easy to just kind of take on, on face value without examining it. Oh, I can't wait to
Yeah.
read what you.
Yeah, it's, writing a book is daunting.
God. It is so stressful writing a book because you have all of these deadlines and you always feel like you cannot possibly get this stuff done in time. And just, so you just sort of quit sleeping altogether, don't you?
Well,
Yeah.
thankfully, I don't have any deadlines. This is just kind of
Uh,
something that I've been working on, and I will probably end up just self-publishing. But I just feel like it's so important to get his story out there, and
yeah,
I want
yeah,
to
yeah.
do the best job possible
Yeah, yeah.
in offering.
There's nothing, I just a totally different subject, but there's nothing wrong with self-publishing because you should get the money for the book that you published. I can't say that strongly enough. I'm sort of forced to publish with university presses because I'm in that world, because I teach for a living. And so my university expects that. I mean, it's part of the whole system. But the best work I think being done today is coming out in self-published volumes. And I just say people should do that because then at least you collect the money that for people buying your book in a way that you don't if I'm working on this is my seventh book. And if I'm lucky, I might make like $200 a year in royalties from all of them, so it's you do it because you're paid a salary for teaching. So that allows you to write books. I mean, that's part of your job. But I absolutely think that you should self-publish. I mean, that makes perfect sense. And excellent stuff comes out in that way now. So I think we're moving towards a different model and good for you.
Oh, I can't wait. You know how it is when you start researching, you just want to tell everybody everything that you're finding, but you can't.
Yep. Yeah. Now you say read my book or wait for my book.
People are like, Rebecca, we've been waiting for your book a really long time. Is this thing ever going to come out?
Well, you can add my voice to the raucous crowd now. When is it coming?
Right. Oh, Tracy, this has been so fun discussing this topic with you today. And I want people to be able to go out and read your article. Can you tell them where they can find it?
Um, it's in the journal called The Court Historian. The problem is that if you don't have JSTOR, if you don't have access to these databases, which are kind of the bane of everyone's existence. If you aren't part of the academic crowd, when you actually have access to this stuff, it's hard to get at. But if anyone is kind enough to want to read this thing, just go to my Facebook page. And because I posted it, because there's access, we've been given access and we were able to post it. So it's right there on my Facebook page. And I'm easy enough to find, I think, my name. And if you look at like University of Auckland or something, when you're searching, you'll find that. And I've got it posted there. I'm also on Blue Sky now, TM Adams on Blue Sky. So I've got it posted there. So anyone who is good enough to want to read it, it's right there. Otherwise, just contact me and I'm more than happy to send you anything you want. And I'm easy to find, my name at the University of Auckland, so I can be very easily traced.
Wonderful. And you said you've written several books or been part of several books. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? And if people are interested in buying those, where they can do so?
Or I'm happy to, you don't have to buy, don't tell my publishers this, but there are other ways of getting things to people. The one that I guess that I am, to the extent that anybody knows anybody in my field, the thing that I'm most known for is a book about Queen Isabel of Bavaria, who was Queen of France in the early 15th century, and she was long vilified. So I've written a book about her. I recently wrote a book about Agnès Sorel, who was the mistress of Charles VII. Once again, just kind of exploring I'm always interested in what people actually said about someone and how we've interpreted those statements. So I do the same thing with Agnès Sorel. And I wrote a book with my sister, Christine Adams, about the French royal mistress, so sort of a survey of how that position came into existence, what it meant, and then we do brief chapters on the most famous of the French royal mistresses, the most powerful of them. So that kind of stuff. That's sort of what I do.
Wonderful. Well, I'll make sure to include a link to your Facebook too, so that if people want to reach out to you. But Tracy, thank you so much for coming on today and talking to me.
I who thank you, Rebecca. It's been really wonderful talking to you. It's so much fun to make contact with a person who is so knowledgeable about the Tudors. So thanks very much for contacting me.
And a native Minnesotan, right?
I'm a native Minnesotan, yeah. Yeah, go Golden Gophers.
That's right. Go Bikes.
Absolutely, yes. And the Twins, well, we won't say anything about the Twins this year, but yeah.
Right. So thank you, Tracy.
Okay, thank you.
And that concludes another episode of the Tudors Dynasty podcast. Thank you so much for listening. If you love the show and would like to show your support, consider becoming a patron over on Patreon. That's patreon.com/Tudors Dynasty. Over there, you'll get commercial-free episodes, early access, and some patron-exclusive content as well. If you would prefer to show your support in another way, head on over to my website, tudorsdynasty.com, and click on the shop to see some of the new merchandise that I have available. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time.
The Tudors Dynasty Podcast.